Hi, I'm Greg. Welcome to Affect Studio. I want to talk about bright caps and other differences in the circuits of guitar amps that change the overall tone of multiple channels. There's been a bit of talk about bright caps recently as Kemper released their liquid profiling, which includes the bright cap in some of the tone stack models. There seems to be a bit of confusion and worse, misinformation about them, particularly in relation to the difference between normal and bright or vibrato channel circuits. The difference in sound between the channels is rarely as simple as the second channel having a bright cap where the first channel doesn't have one. If someone has only compared the liquid tone stack models in the Kemper, I can understand how they come to that conclusion. They're forgetting that the liquid tone stack model isn't changing the fundamental sound character or response of the amp though. The Kemper isn't the modeler. The sound of the amp still comes from the profile. The liquid models are simply giving us the same EQ controls as the amp. There are other changes in the circuit of the bright channels beyond just having a bright cap. The bright cap is incredibly simple and works in the same way as a treble bleed circuit in a guitar. It's a small value capacitor that is connected between the input terminal and wiper of a volume pot or potentiometer that appears to let through more high frequencies as the volume is decreased. In reality, other than when the pot is on full or completely down, the capacitor is letting through a fixed amount of high frequency signal at all volumes. All we are doing is turning down the main, full range unfiltered part of the signal. So as we turn the volume pot down, the ratio between the high frequencies and direct signal changes. So what you basically got is this, capacitor letting through the high frequencies up here, then you've got the main full range signal, coming through the main part of the pot. And as you turn that down, the ratio there, the distance between the two increases, so when it gets down to the the lower settings, that's why amps with bright caps usually sound thin and scratchy at low volumes. It's just because that hasn't actually moved at all. The value of the capacitor dictates the cutoff frequency. The bigger the cap value, the lower the cutoff. Bright caps use very small capacitor values, which is why only the high frequencies pass through them. If you used a large enough capacitor, all frequencies would pass through, effectively rendering the pot inactive until you turned it all the way down, where it will short out the signal. Kemper thoughtfully give us a control to set the percentage of the bright cap that's in the circuit. I love this as I really want much, if any, of the bright cap, particularly at low volumes. I really don't like the scratchy sound. The first liquid profile I made sounded terrible when I turned down the gain until I realised their model included a bright cap. I turned that down or off, I can't remember, and it sounded great. While the bright cap is significant and often unwanted, the difference in sound between the channels in Fender and especially Marshall amps is more than whether or not there is a capacitor across the volume pot. For Fender amps, there isn't a huge difference in the circuits. They use a lower value coupling capacitor between the gain stages after the EQ and the vibrato channel, which tightens up the low end. For example, the normal channel in most blackface Fenders uses a 0.047 microfarad capacitor, where the bright channel uses a 0.022 microfarad cap. Being half the capacitance value, the bright channel will roll off the low end starting an octave higher. So it isn't just that the bright cap is making it clearer, it's also that the lows don't extend as far. So removing a bright cap will make the channels sound similar, but there is still a difference in the low end. Very different with the Marshall. With the non-master 2-channel plexi-style Marshall, they use the same value coupling capacitors for both channels, but use very different values for the cathode bypass caps on the first gain stages. The cathode resistor sets the gain for the valve or tube. Adding a capacitor in parallel with that resistor works as a high-pass filter, letting through more signal, therefore increasing the gain. The value of that cap once again shapes the tone. A larger value lets through all frequencies, while a smaller value reduces bass content. The standard cathode bypass cap value used in Fender amps, which will boost the full range of guitar frequencies, is 25 microfarads. For the Plexi normal channel, they use a massive 330 microfarad bypass cap, extending the low end massively and making it very dark. The bright channel uses a tiny 0.68 microfarad cap, which has the effect of boosting the upper mids. This is why there is such a distinct difference in sound between those channels. Unlike a Fender, where the sound of the channels is very similar, with just a slight reduction in low frequencies in the bright channel, if you remove the cap from the bright channel of a Plexi, the two channels will still sound very different. So this is why you can't make the profile of a Marshall bright channel sound like the normal channel by simply swapping the normal channel model or vice versa. Much more going on than whether or not it has a bright cap. As far as Kemper having liquid models of normal and bright channels, I can only assume it's to make it easier to remove the bright caps, as other than that, the tone controls should work and sound exactly the same. Remember, a Marshall has a shared tone stack. The change in the voices of the inputs comes at the first preamp stages, which also means that it doesn't matter if you have, say, an AC30 from the 2000s, but the Kemper model is from the 60s. The amps don't sound exactly the same for a number of reasons, but the tone stack circuit is unchanged since they introduced a top boost in the mid-60s. Even if the controls do respond slightly differently, the main part of the sound is still the profile of the amp. The tone stack model isn't adding anything to the profile. Same with Marshall, and most Fenders are the same model. Even if there are slight changes in the circuits, the basic tone controls are still working the same way for most generations of the amps. Remember, the Kemper isn't a modeler, the tone of the amp comes from the profile. This is obviously a brief and fairly simplified explanation, but hopefully gives you an idea of what's going on with the different circuits and will help you make more informed choices. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. Please like and subscribe, hit the drop down menu button as you subscribe and select the bell notification option too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.